This scrumptious little church is St Mary's at Thornham Parva in Suffolk, a place name that means Little Thornham, and I'm going to give you a little tour of it. As we will discover, inside the church is one of the most significant works of art to survive from medieval England, a retable or altarpiece that somehow survived the English Reformation. But more on that when we explore the interior. For first, let us linger a while and savour the beautiful exterior of this church, which I visited on a gloriously warm day in late March, the spring sunshine really setting off the building. St Mary's is fairly typical of the small rural churches you find in East Anglia. There is nothing ostentatious about it, it is simplicity itself. Constructed primarily of locally occurring flint and with the sparing use of imported limestone, it is one of only 100 churches in England that still have a thatched roof, rather than being covered in lead or tiles. I suspect it has always been thatched. When the church was constructed in the late 12th century, it was tiny. It consisted only of a single cell building, a simple rectangle that contained both the nave and the chancel. The funny little stubby tower at the west end was added in 1486, and it was constructed by a couple of contractors called Richard Cutting and John Tilley. We only know this because the pair of them were cowboy builders who didn't do the work properly. Although charging 10.5 marks to do it, which was a tidy sum in the 1480s, the parishioners had to sue the pair of them for damages, as after the tower was constructed, part of its wall collapsed and the whole tower was riven with cracks. Anyway, despite the shoddy building work, the tower is still standing over 500 years later. The churchwardens should have found themselves a decent architect. Talking of which, in the corner of the churchyard here at Thornham Parva is the grave of the 20th century architect Sir Basil Spence and his wife Joan. He was of course responsible for the construction of the new modernist Coventry Cathedral in the 1950s, and he retired to Yaxley Hall in the neighbouring parish in 1970 and died there in 1976. Back to the fabric of the church, and there are telltale giveaways that tell us that this is a Norman church. The simple round-headed door to the south and a single tiny round-headed window. When this church was constructed in the 12th century, it would have been very dark within, lit perhaps by only a handful of small windows of this sort. But in the 14th and 15th century, larger windows were punched through the walls to give more light to the interior. Okay, so let's go and have a look inside. And we have to enter the church through the north doorway. Incidentally, if you're in the area, the church is open every day from 10 until 4. As we enter, we find a lovely, light, bright interior that is beautifully well kept. And as we look east towards the altar and we get our bearings, you'll notice that there is no arch to divide the nave from the chancel, as you find in many other churches, only a simple timber rood screen, which incidentally has been in this position since the late 15th century. Up above and close to the roof, the stumps of the cut-off rood beam that before the Reformation supported the great rood cross are still built into the wall. Beyond the screen in the chancel is the great retable, but we'll get to that in a moment after we've looked over the rest of the building. There are a number of old chests in the church. This one beside the altar is made of Baltic pine and it dates from the 14th century and may well have been used in the Middle Ages to store vestments and silver. There are quite a number of these chests in Suffolk. They're believed to have been imported into Ipswich. So turning around to face west and the back of the church, above the Victorian font, is a timber west gallery of the late 18th or early 19th century. Before the introduction of organs into churches, such galleries accommodated the parish bands that accompanied worship on their fiddles, trombones and serpents. Both the north and the south walls of the nave are decorated with the remains of faded but still rather beautiful medieval wall paintings. Painted in a range of earth pigments, these likely date from the early years of the 13th century. They may well have been painted out entirely after the 15th century, as two late medieval windows have been punched right through the walls, destroying the central part of both decorative schemes. The paintings on the north wall are rather faint now, but they're believed to depict the life and legends of St Edmund, the Saxon king of East Anglia martyred by the Vikings and the one-time patron of England. The only bit that is really clear in this narrative is the area to the far left, which shows the relics of St Edmund being carried in a reliquary, probably at their translation to the new shrine in St Edmundsbury in the 12th century. These paintings all have delightful foliage borders, as you'd expect for 13th century work, and at the bottom of them can be seen a series of painted crosses, marking the positions where the bishop anointed and consecrated this church when it was first built at the end of the 12th century. The paintings on the south wall of the nave are much clearer, and they depict scenes from the Nativity of Christ. There is a scene of the adoration of the shepherds and the Magi. The Magi have been cut off by the construction of the 15th century window. Further along the wall, we can see the angel Gabriel proclaiming to the shepherds the birth of Christ. How gloriously resplendent and colourful this little church would have been when it was completed around the year 1200. I've kept you waiting long enough. Let's go and have a look at the great treasure of this church, which is in the chancel, the so-called Thornham Parva Retable, a medieval altarpiece from the 1330s. The term retable means a table, a tablet, that goes behind an altar. It is obvious that this retable wasn't made for this church. As you can see, it only just fits under the window against the east walls, and it reaches nearly to the north and south walls of the chancel. It was made for a much larger church building, but more of that in a moment. The retable only came here in 1927, shortly after it was found among various bits of detritus and rubbish in the stable loft of Thornham Magna Hall, about a quarter of a mile from the church. The owner of the hall at the time, the 6th Lord Henniker, gave it to this church because his younger brother Victor Henniker Major was the rector here. At the end of the last century, the Hamilton Kerr Institute in Cambridge took this altarpiece away for about 5 years and conserved it, and now it glows with glorious colour. The central panel of the retable is a depiction of the crucifixion of Christ. Christ crucified is hung between the traditional figures of his mother, the Virgin Mary, and the beloved disciple St John. But because of the constraints of the panel's height, he is set almost at eye level with them, and this gives a rather moving immediacy to the scene. Notice as we look in depth at this painting that all the figures in it are highly stylised. They have elongated bodies and sinuous long limbs. They have an organic S-shaped swaying posture to them, as though they're almost dancing. Art historians have known for many years that this sort of stylisation is typical of English panel painting from the second quarter of the 14th century, from the 1330s and 1340s. In recent years, modern science in the form of dendrochronology has proved what us art historians knew already. The oak that this altarpiece was made from was felled at the very end of the 1320s. Around the central image of the crucifixion are images of the saints. To either side are the princes of the apostles, St Peter and St Paul, the former with the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the latter with the sword of his martyrdom. The saints are then arranged in pairs, as though they're in the midst of some sort of heavenly conversation. St Peter, for example, is having a chat with St John the Baptist, who's dressed in his camel hair coat and is gesturing at the tablet he holds in his hand, bearing the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. Some of the saints depicted help provide a possible original context for the piece. At the far left-hand side of the retable is a figure in a black and white habit. This is St Dominic, the founder of the Mendicant Order of Preachers, and he's in conversation with St Catherine, who's carrying the wheel on which she was tortured. At the opposite end of the altarpiece is another Dominican friar chatting to St Margaret. He has a wound in his abdomen and he's got an axe embedded in his head. This is St. Peter of Verona, otherwise known as St. Peter Martyr, a Dominican friar who was assassinated in 1252 and canonised only 11 months later. Lastly, St. Paul is talking with a saint we have already encountered in this church, Suffolk's own saint, St. Edmund of East Anglia. He is dressed in his kingly state and finery, and he is holding an arrow in his hand. Edmund was martyred with the sword for refusing to be a client king of the Vikings. But before he was martyred, the Viking leader Ivar the Boneless had him shot full of arrows until he resembled, so his hagiographer says, in the 12th century, a hedgehog. The two Dominicans and St. Edmund, and of course the discovery of this retable in East Anglia, do create a possible context for the piece. It has been convincingly argued that the retable was originally made for the high altar of the Dominican Priory at Thetford in Norfolk, which is only 20 miles from Thornham Parva. What is more, the foundation date of the Black Friars at Thetford fits with the date of the retable. The priory was founded in 1335 by Henry, Earl of Lancaster, a grandson of King Henry III. So how did this extraordinary and exquisite panel painting survive the English Reformation and find its way to a rural barn? Well, we don't really know. It was likely removed by recusant Catholics at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries and was perhaps hidden by them. It appears to have been purchased in a sale in 1778 by Lord Henniker's ancestor, Sir John Major, and he purchased it from the Fox family, who were a prominent family of Suffolk recusants. The Foxes were living at Rookery Farm, a country house in the middle of nowhere, close to Stradbrook, just 10 miles from Thornham Parva, and the retable was in use in the Catholic chapel that the family had established, hidden from prying eyes in their attic. The Fox family had lived at Rookery Farm since the 16th century, and perhaps the retable came into their hands shortly after the dissolution of the monasteries. Thank goodness it has survived, and what is more, we have the opportunity of enjoying it in the 21st century in the stillness and peace of Thornham Parva Church, where it just glows like a precious jewel set in an ancient casket. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.